viewers! Welcome to the second half of my requested Zoids review. For anyone new, Guardian Force is a direct sequel, technically the second half of the same season, to Chaotic Century, so if you don't know what's happened up to this point in the first 34 episodes, I suggest you go watch that review first. I originally split this into two reviews because there was just too much to discuss in one, but now I'm glad I did for another reason. The overall focus and tone of Guardian Force is very different from Chaotic Century, but I'll get to that. Because there was so much going on in this show, I tried to limit my first review to discussing only the plot points and characters who were necessary to understanding the story. And then, of course, I started Guardian Force and discovered there were a few things I should have added in but didn't, so you'll have to excuse me for backtracking a little throughout this review. First is Dr. D, which, as far as I've been able to tell, stands for Dr. Deus Ex Machina. He's this quirky old man that our heroes encountered fairly early into Chaotic Century. He's actually frozen by one of his own experiments at the time. Once he's thawed out, they learn that he's also a skilled Zoid mechanic, and basically from that point on, whenever the kids run into a problem they can't solve themselves, Dr. D will show up out of nowhere with the answer, usually in the form of a new battle strategy or a Zoid upgrade. He was a fun character, just not directly necessary to understanding the story, but this information is needed to understand the bridge between Chaotic Century and Guardian Force. Episode 34 leaves us on the night of Prince Rudolph's coronation to become Emperor. Van and Fiona don't actually stay for the ceremony, which I didn't add in because I didn't think they were actually going to leave Irvine and Moonbay behind. But no, the group all splits up for a while after this point. For the next year, Irvine and Moonbay, presumably, go back to whatever they were doing before, drifting around the desert. Van trains with the army to become a better Zoid pilot, and Fiona becomes Dr. D's assistant, learning how to fix up Zoids herself and continuing to explore ancient ruins in the search for Zoid Eve, which they find practically no information on. But we'll get back to Fiona. I expect this review to be much more character-focused than plot-focused, and there's a very good reason for that. The war is over. The Empire and the Republic are at peace, and they work together to create the Guardian Force, a division of the military that's job is, basically, to maintain that peace. The Guardian Force is responsible for everything from mercenaries, former soldiers who were displeased with how the war ended, and Zoid smugglers, to much bigger threats. But we'll introduce our new villains in due time. First, there's a new ally to discuss. But first, let me direct you back to Chaotic Century again for a moment. Remember that back when they were at war, the Imperial Army was split between those who supported Prozin in his quest for total domination, and those who wanted peace and were willing to make some sacrifices to achieve that. Karl Schubaltz became the face of the reasonable soldier, the one willing to disobey orders so as not to cause more damage or put more people at risk than absolutely necessary. He was actually one of my favorite characters. He just didn't do much to directly impact the major plot developments, and thus was left out of my review. But now, after a year of training separately, Van and Fiona come back together to be appointed to the Guardian Force. They are soon given a mission and told to meet up with Schubaltz, but to their disappointment, and mine, we find that there's been a lapse in communication. It's not the Karl Schubaltz that we all know and love that they'll be working with, but his younger brother Thomas. I suppose Thomas isn't an inherently bad character, but I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the younger Schubaltz. It seems pretty clear to me that Thomas was written in to highlight how much Van has grown up in the past year. He may be good at heart and eventually warm up to Van, but the fact is, Thomas is rude and arrogant. After defeating the Death Star, Van has gotten the reputation of a hero, and Thomas isn't willing to believe any of it until he sees Van's abilities with his own eyes. He's got an obvious crush on Fiona, and he loses his temper easily. Frankly, Thomas was just annoying, and it's not like he was a super accomplished Zoid pilot to make up for it. Thomas suffers defeat more than any other character, usually as an excuse for our heroes to learn something new about our villain's abilities, but this doesn't humble him any, and Van handles their new teammate with a grace and patience that he never could have shown a year ago. Didn't discuss the characters much in my review for Chaotic Century, because I figured there'd be time to sum it all up later, but now that Irvine and Moonbay have been demoted to side characters, let me just say that Thomas's introduction was an interesting flip in the team's dynamic. I can't say Irvine never did anything rash, but it was clearly his job to be the level-headed one. He reined in Van whenever our hero hadn't thought things through. That's not really necessary now that Van has matured, and while they do end up helping out, I can admit that being part of the Guardian Force isn't really Irvine and Moonbay's style. I was sad to see them go, especially when it looked like Thomas was supposed to be their replacement, but they were kept in character at least, and I can't really fault that. Doesn't this show have a plot? Some of you must be wondering by now. Well, that's exactly what I thought at times. The storytelling in Guardian Force is much more episodic. The main focus in Chaotic Century was the war, and then the capture and rescue of Prince Rudolph. Now there's a new mini-plot every other episode or so. I know they're doing an important job, but I missed the storytelling of Chaotic Century. There were some new villains running through the whole season, and I suppose it's about time to introduce them. First is Hiltz. He's got an organoid of his own and is introduced very early on, but his evil plans aren't explained until the very last episode, so we'll come back to him. Next is Reese, or the Blue Devil as she's first called. Her organoid, they don't seem quite so rare anymore, do they? Anyway, her organoid gives her the power to get into people's minds and hypnotize them. It's also revealed pretty early on that Reese is also an ancient Zoidian. Her reasoning for teaming up with Hiltz wasn't really explored, but it is revealed that when she first woke up, presumably from a slumber like Fiona's, she found herself in a village that didn't take well to outsiders. There was one little boy who befriended her, and he died trying to protect her when the village was attacked. So her motivations are revenge, I guess? We'll come back to Reese, too. Lastly, we see the return of Raven, and though it may be a little rushed, he is easily the most developed character in the whole series. So, Raven survived his final battle with Van, but it's left him in quite a state. He spent the last year wandering the desert in a bit of a trance, apparently at a loss of what to do with himself now. He's reawakened upon meeting back up with Van, and determines to destroy him, again. He's soon recruited by Hiltz and Reese, given power, and starts destroying things, again. So basically we're back where we started with him, but we are finally given a backstory for Raven. To go back to Chaotic Century, hopefully for the last time, Prozin does reveal before his defeat that Shadow, Raven's organoid, originally belonged to Van's father. I can't say this wasn't a big deal at the time, but let's just say you will be hard-pressed to find an important military figure in this show, ally or villain, who isn't connected to Van's father in some way. So at the time, it kinda just felt like a cheap way to make the scene even more dramatic, but this particular point does come back into play. It turns out Raven's parents were studying organoids. One night, the organoid pod they were caring for hatched, and the organoid inside killed them both. It is shown that Raven had a hatred for Zoids from a very early age, presumably at first just because they ate up all his parents' time, and then because he viewed them as evil, destructive beasts. And his response was to be the most destructive of all. Well, anyway, young Raven is found and taken in by Van's father, who was also studying organoids. Van's dad was actually planning to bring Raven back to the Wind Colony and raise him as a second son, which is really interesting to think about considering Van and Raven then grew up to be nemeses, but it wasn't to be. Just as his organoid hatches, Prozin shows up. Shadow escapes, Van's father is killed in the ensuing battle, and Raven is now taken in by Prozin, who raises him to be the perfect, mindless little soldier. Which also has some holes in it, as Raven was never that great about following orders, but I'm not complaining. Prozin's men eventually recapture Shadow, Raven tames him, and you know the story from there. There are about 10 episodes left when we finally get some inkling as to what Guardian Force's final conflict will be. Hiltz has been using Raven's power to collect Zoid cores, which are basically a Zoid's heart, the thing that makes them alive, and he plans to fuse them all together to make a Zoid that's even more powerful than the Death Soarer. And soon after he achieves this goal, there's a bit of a falling out amongst our villains. By this point, Reese's heart hasn't been in it for a while. It could be possible that she never actually wanted to destroy all civilization and can now see that Hiltz is serious, but I also think it has at least a little to do with one of the series' earlier mini-plots. This particular plot culminated in this big underwater battle, and our heroes risk their own lives to make sure Reese doesn't drown after they defeat her. I suspect Reese was only aligned with Hiltz in the first place because she felt it was the only place she was accepted, not because she was actually evil, so her defection wasn't much of a surprise. And then there's Raven. Hiltz's Death Stinger comes to life during the last battle between Raven and Van, and he fires it in their general direction, clearly without a care for the consequences. The attack hits Raven instead, supposedly killing Shadow. Well, Raven finally has a change of heart now that his only friend, which he wouldn't even admit until this point, is gone. While our heroes come together to fight this new enemy, Raven and Reese take some time off to regroup. Reese, being an ancient Zoidian, finally comes back into play as she brings Raven to a cave that she says houses the Zoid Eve. Which brings us back to Fiona. Like in Chaotic Century, Fiona's past is brought up very early on and made out to be really important, only to then be ignored until the final few episodes. She mentions that she seems to have remembered everything. Except the important stuff, of course. So all we really know is that her name is Elise Lynette, and she's part of an ancient race that was nearly destroyed by last season's final boss. But as Guardian Force wraps up, we finally get the answers we've been waiting for since the very beginning. Zoid Eve is the energy source that gives life to all Zoids. Reese and Raven arrive at the cave to find Prozin, or rather the gooey, cyborgy mess that has become Prozin. Apparently, Prozin fused with the Death Soarer's Zoid core when he was defeated and has been giving orders to Hiltz ever since. Now the Zoid Eve is awakening again, and all he needs is Fiona to open the door. This last bit I found really interesting. When she first woke up, Fiona was all she remembered. Van assumed this was her name, and that's what we've been calling her ever since, but it turns out Fiona was a password of sorts to reopen the city that housed Zoid Eve, and as she opens it, she finally gets the rest of her memory back. It turns out the time of the ancient Zoidians was as close to a utopia as this world has ever seen, until people started using Zoids to fight each other. When this got out of hand, the ancient Zoidians created the Death Soarer to restore peace. Except they couldn't control it, and it nearly destroyed everything. This left the ancient Zoidians with a choice. If they destroyed the Zoid Eve, it would put an end to the Death Soarer, as well as all the other Zoids on the planet. Obviously, they were unable to go through with it, and nearly all of the ancient Zoidians were destroyed, and Fiona was put to sleep, to reawaken should the world ever need her power again. So now the world is facing the same dilemma, made even more problematic when you stop to consider that the humans have created a society where they can't really get by without the Zoids. I won't tell you how it ends, even though I've spoiled just about everything else up to this point. I think it's about time I sum up my thoughts on Guardian Force as a whole. I'll be honest, I prefer Chaotic Century. I found the story to be a lot more engaging, and even the side plot episodes were usually devoted to character development, which couldn't always be said about the second half of Zoids. Guardian Force didn't really get good until the last 10 episodes. I did really like the end of Zoids when they finally unveiled the plot. It was hard not to get caught up in the battles. I imagine the writing went a little like this. Alright guys, how can we make this even more extreme? They go to space, they go to the center of the Earth, they have a cannon that makes black holes. And after spending so much time with him and seeing him grow up, I came to really like Van's character. There were aspects of Guardian Force that I liked, but I was left feeling like it paled in comparison to the first half of the series. Hiltz in particular was a low point, which is problematic as he's supposed to be the final villain. I said I would come back to him, but there's not much more to say. He was a very one-note villain, easily the least developed character. There is one final twist I won't spoil, but even that doesn't explain why he's doing what he's doing. CubeSolver64, I would like to thank you one last time for being my first request and for introducing me to Zoids. It had its flaws, but I did really enjoy the series as a whole. I may even look into some of the spin-off series sometime in the future. But that's it for this review. Thank you for watching.